Welcome everyone to our Oceana webinar. Today's topic, Faithful Stewards of God's Grace. We're today exploring that amazing world of lay pastoral ministry. My name is Etha Mcgraw. I'm the Director of Pastoral Planning in the Diocese of Parramatta. And today I'm joined by Sister Grace Raklowska. Grace is a sister of the Holy Family of Nazareth, and also works here at the Institute for Mission. So welcome, Grace. How are you?
Very well, thank you, Richard, and welcome everyone. My role is very, very small. I will be on the other end of the chat, and Richard will tell you all about it at due time, but it's my privilege to be part of this conference.
Thank you. And Grace, I will also invite you now to offer an acknowledgement of the First Peoples of our nations. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Although we are meeting virtually, we continue to acknowledge the traditional custodians that have walked upon and cared for the lands upon which we are all individually located. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and future.
Thank you, Grace. We also take a moment to acknowledge that we are in the presence of our loving God. An amazing God, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the gift of one another. We thank you for this ability to connect across the miles, and for all those that are involved in pastoral ministry, ordained and lay, and all those who we seek to serve and accompany in our call to be faithful disciples. We pray for those in the past, the saints of the past, who've really been the ones that have inspired us to this place today. And we pray for each of us, those online and those connected, who are the saints of the present, who we are called to be. And of course, we pray for the saints of tomorrow, who are seeking to form in this amazing journey of faith with our God. We make these prayers through Christ our Lord. So welcome again. Just a couple of housekeeping things for us as we begin. One thing, if you're new to Zoom, you'll notice that you are being muted, or if you can please set yourself to mute. There were some instructions, I think, in the registrations. When the registration information, you also receive the videos that you can watch at your leisure. Hopefully some of you have had that chance. I know a lot of people registered last night. I think we're up to 200, and then this morning we're up to 250 people that were registered. So we haven't had a chance to get those videos to you, but we will. And I'm pretty sure too, you probably wouldn't have watched them in the middle of the night anyway. So that we really encourage you to do so when you get the opportunity. Finally, just a reminder that we are being recorded today. And again, that would be in the pre-material that has been sent to you. But as we start, we've welcome one another, but I'd invite us now to move into share groups in a moment, and you'll see on screen that this is a chance just to say hi to a few people, maybe have someone just to manage your time together so that everyone gets a chance. We only have 5 minutes for this, so please be brief in your introduction, and you might either share something about a question or what your understanding of lay pastoral ministry is, or if you have a chance to look at the videos, something that you'd like to share from them. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you back in about 5 minutes' time. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed a few minutes there just to connect with a few other people in our region. One of the things we can do today, of course, is to access our chat and to offer any inspirations, questions, ideas, your wisdom into that space. After today, we gather up as much material as we can and put it into frequently asked questions or other bits and pieces of resources that people might share in the chat. Sometimes people put links in. It's terrific to have that shared wisdom. In a moment, we'll be welcoming Dr. Etha Mcgraw, but just before we do, we also just welcome those that might have just come in the last few minutes. And again, we're just reminding ourselves that today we are keeping people on mute during this time. But also when we come back from the next break, we'll have an opportunity to some of your questions from the chat we'll be able to offer to Etha for her consideration. So have a bit of a think. If there's something in particular that you wanted her to share her wisdom on or to comment on, you're most welcome to do that. So our special guest today, Dr. Etha Mcgraw. She's joining us in a few minutes. I think it's about midnight time there, so we'll just make sure she's awake. But while we're doing so, Etha has a doctorate in moral theology, and she has been involved in earlier times as I think she did that after she got her doctorate, as a parish pastoral worker in Ireland in a couple of parishes. She's also been over here in Australia, and I know that when we're having when this webinar was coming up, that Etha will be happy to hear that she's got some groupies here, because people said, oh, that's terrific, because she was in our diocese and she shared a seminar or session with us, and so they're very keen to come back. But Etha, while she was here, did some research work, project work with both the Pastoral Research Office in Australia, as it was called back then, and the Christian Research Association. And she now works in the position as the Director of Pastoral Theology at Maynooth College. So we're just going to patch Etha in now. Welcome, Etha. Hope all is well with you at your end and we didn't get you out of bed at midnight there.
I was very tempted to be in my pajamas to join you, but I said, no, I better make an effort.
Fantastic.
Good to see everyone.
It's terrific that you're with us, and we're just very grateful for your own journey. I think you both witness as well as share so much wisdom in terms of lay pastoral ministry and just what that is. So, but of course, today we're going to be exploring just that area of lay pastoral ministry a little bit more. And I think I was delighted with the video that you offered, and I know other people have already commented that it offers a great framework or foundation. One of the first things I noted about the video was it was quite timely. I wasn't sure if you'd actually been on to Pope Francis, but Pope Francis announced now that, of course, women are now able to engage in both as acolytes and as lectors and those roles. Now, of course, this probably came as a surprise to some people that had already been operating in those roles for some time. And I know there's been a bit of confusion about what we call roles such as that when it wasn't actually instituted for women. And one of the things you touch on, I think, in your video, which you think is so important for our framework, is that theological space of the four voices. So I think just as we start today, I'd be really keen for you to, for those that haven't had a chance to watch the videos, just to break open a little bit what you mean by these four voices of theology and why that's going to be important for our discussion today.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Richard. I guess it was a bit of a strange choice to choose to start talking about a theology of four voices when my brief was to speak about the theology of lay pastoral ministry. But I thought I would be modeling something really like a narrow understanding of theology. If I, as the theological expert, just laid out an understanding of lay pastoral ministry without first acknowledging that theology is much broader than just the academic theologian, or indeed even church teaching, that it involves each person. And while, so I didn't want to be the active person in this, in whether it was someone watching the pre-recorded video or watching the webinar this evening or tuning into the webinar. I didn't want to be the active one while everyone else would be passive. So I started with the four voices to help us kind of get an understanding. And if the slide is there, we might have a look at it together. I started with this framework in order to help us understand the complexity even of speaking about a theology of lay pastoral ministry, where that theology comes from and what our place might be within that. I think the two top voices there of theology, the normative theology and the formal theology, even if we're not used to that terminology, I think they're the two voices of theology we're most familiar with. The formal theology is what we would consider the academic theologians, the professionals, those that the nerds like myself that spend time with books, reading. The normative theology is basically, authoritative sources within our tradition. Maybe the writings of church leaders, our scripture, etc. So that's what we usually associate, I think, with theology. But what I want to remind people watching the video and those our participants here this evening is that we actually all have an espoused theology. Every one of us, when we try to articulate, we mightn't be so fluent. It might be difficult to find words to express our faith, but everyone that tries to speak something about their faith is espousing a theology. So whether we're talking about our understanding of the church or whether we're talking about our understanding of lay pastoral ministry, we're espousing a theological understanding. So like I tell my students, we don't come to the theology of anything, and especially not the theology of lay pastoral ministry, as blank pages. We come with our experience, we come with how we've been shaped in our families and communities, and we bring that to our reflections. The other voice of theology that might be a surprise to people is that actually the way we live our lives and our behavior and our practices in ministry also give voice to a theology. It's embedded in the way we live our lives. So there might be a difference between what I say, which is my espoused theology, and what I actually do. There might be a gap between what I say and I do. And I found when I was working as a pastoral worker, actually, a lot of the difficulties I faced in lay pastoral ministry were the differences that I realized between my espoused theology or my operant theology and those of my colleagues in ministry and members of the parish team, maybe, or the pastoral council or our pastoral area teams. So not that I used those terms at the time. I mean, this four voices is a relatively new framework for myself as well, but I really find it helpful for myself and students to try and be aware of the complexity. Now, you mentioned Pope Francis and his very recent announcement or change to our canon law, so that incorporates lay women into the ministries of lector and acolyte. And what that four voices actually helps us to understand as well, that our normative and formal theology might actually be far behind our operant theology. Our practices, and most often in lay pastoral ministry, our practices far outstrip our normative and formal theology. It takes time for the theologians and the church leadership and the writings of church leadership to catch up actually with what we're doing, because in the reality, and I'm sure participants would agree, when we're trying to respond to the needs within our communities, a lot of creativity happens, a lot of innovation, and that in itself is a living theology and developing as we go.
Thank you very much for that. And I think that for me, it just sort of taps into just the complexity of what it means to be part of this Catholic Church, that we experience one thing, don't we? And we know something else, and then we sort of struggle with perhaps what we hear others talk about, and we may even struggle to know whether what I'm doing is actually what I should be doing. So it's a fascinating place. But what I hear you saying is to encourage us to really have confidence in that witness, in that exploration, in that we're sort of like pioneers, aren't we, I suppose, in this space of lay pastoral ministry. But just to tease this open a little bit more, you also in your video, you were very keen to distinguish between discipleship and lay pastoral ministry. So before we go into a real definition of lay pastoral ministry, I just wanted to explore that with you. So, I mean, for myself, I know that as a young person, I sort of had this sort of revelation that I really just wanted to follow Jesus. Whatever he wanted me to do, I was just going to do that. And that was in my at uni, with my friends and family. And then I got really engaged with different things that were going on in at Mass. I think I was involved in about 5 different ministries at one Mass one day, and the youth group, etc. So in all that sort of muddle of exploration, what do you mean by the difference between discipleship and lay pastoral ministry? Why is that so significant for you?
For me, I guess I've come to this understanding of the distinction, but the relationship between discipleship and ministry as a result of my experience in lay pastoral ministry and listening to the voices of those that I've been privileged enough to interview, whether that be in Australia or in Ireland, in connection with lay pastoral ministry, as well as all the time I've spent reading the formal and normative theology on it. And there's a lot of diversity in our normative and formal theology around whether all baptized people are called to ministry, or whether all are called to discipleship and some are called to ministry. And I agree, I mentioned Cahalan in the video, and I've come to the same understanding as she has in terms of the importance of emphasizing that we're all baptized people share in the Christian vocation to discipleship, and that any form of ministry, whether it's ordained or religious or lay, is actually an expression of our discipleship. It's a way that we live out our discipleship. So when she says every minister is a disciple, but not every disciple is a minister, there's something saying about there's a distinction between discipleship and ministry. And I suppose it's difficult to try and quantify what that difference might be if we exclude the role of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit is integral in trying to understand what this theology is trying to express. The Holy Spirit gifts everybody with grace to exercise their discipleship. So we're all gifted, we're all made fit and ready to fully participate in the mission of the church, which is our call to discipleship. And then some are further gifted for leadership. Now, if we understand that leadership to be leading others in their discipleship, we can't remove our understanding of ministry from discipleship, because otherwise ministry would become self-serving. Ministry is a calling to lead others in discipleship, and it needs to maintain that to the forefront of its mind. If every minister needs to keep that to the forefront of their mind. So I guess what I'm trying to emphasize when I started there is that we're all called to fully participate in the mission of the church as disciples. And some do that by means of being called to and gifted for a leadership ministry.
Terrific. Yeah, look, I love that language, because for me it's an affirmation. I suppose the other language we sometimes hear is universal call to holiness, or through our baptism, that we're all then involved in this mission. We're all called. And I know perhaps more so in the olden days, that sense of vocation, even if we heard the word vocation, we would only hear it in terms of people that perhaps were called to priesthood or religious life. And the rest of us lay people, it was a sense of, well, I haven't really got a calling. I suppose I'm just here to help or support what these people who I see so actively in the church are doing. And so you're, in a sense, here distinguishing the fact that, you know, from the very moment we jump on board for the ride with God, that we have, we're active, we participate, we have to find our own giftedness, which may have nothing to do with any formal ministry. So we're just about to go to a break for people to break this open a bit more, but I just want to then land on this notion of lay pastoral ministry, because it's in the other videos that Kari and I had a chance to talk about when we were asking people around Australia, the different dioceses, and we were sort of ringing them up saying, have you got any lay pastoral ministers there? And they said, no, we haven't got anyone like that. And we said, oh, have you got any pastoral associates or catechists or youth workers, maybe people working in your schools or chaplains? And they said, oh, we've got all of those things. So the language is difficult to the ear. Now, you've mentioned leadership. Did you want to give us, just before we go to the break, a bit of a formal definition then for yourself about what we mean by this? What do we mean by lay pastoral ministry for this conversation?
Yeah, I think that is the important distinction for me, that lay pastoral ministry is a leadership ministry. It's those that are in formal positions, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting paid for those positions, but informal public leadership positions, working on behalf of their community. There's that sense of representing the community. And that they could be in diverse settings. It could be in parishes or dioceses or schools or hospitals or prisons. But the important thing is that they realize the responsibility is not theirs alone. Like I mentioned earlier, they're there to enable the co-responsibility of all. I think it's the privilege of being the one invited to draft the guidelines document, or to help you in working in your ACC LPM. So my understanding of lay pastoral ministry is actually outlined in that document. And in page 32 to 33, I really tried to, because like you say, the term lay pastoral ministry, there's so much diversity within it. And we might get caught up in the language of you know, and trying excluding some and including others, and that's really not what the idea is about. It's just that it's about discerning people's giftedness, building on those gifts, enabling them further with education and formation. I've a leaning towards that, given the role that I'm in at the moment, and from there appointing or employing or authorizing, or whatever the language we use, to a particular expression of ministry. And like you mentioned, there's a lot of specializations. It might be sacramental preparation or catechesis or whatever it might be. But does that help? It's just, I'm conscious of the time that you're up against the clock.
Yeah, I think that gives us a good entree. And I think in terms of we'll be breaking open after the share groups into a bit more detail about these best practices of lay pastoral ministry. But that word lay too, I know that you're very conscious to point out, Etha, and as we were on the Lay Pastoral Ministry Council with the bishops, that we see ourselves very much obviously complementing the work of our ordained colleagues. So it's ordained and lay together, isn't it, that in this space of ministry. So there's a few things we're coming to terms with here. One is the idea of ministry as distinct from our call or our discipleship. Then there's that sense of that pastoral domain, which I suppose is the breadth and depth of where we find ourselves in ministry. And some people, probably, it might be the first time today they really think of themselves as a lay pastoral minister in a particular role they might be in. And the third thing that we're wanting to emphasise here too is the complexity of this landscape, that people have different titles. Some people are volunteers, some people are employed. We've got people that are operating as clergy alongside lay people, all sorts of different ways of relating. And so this is really what we're wanting to open up for the group now. So I'm going to invite us, I'm going to put up on screen some questions for your next group discussion. And hopefully what we've done, at least to this stage, is stimulate your thinking around some of the complexities in this space of lay pastoral ministry. And so again, this will be a time to introduce yourself. Important that we have a facilitator in your group, which is a fancy word for time management. You've got 15 minutes for this. So what are you hearing? What are you finding helpful, and what questions do you have? It's a real time for us to ensure that we too maybe share something of our own story of lay pastoral ministry and the good, the bad and the ugly of that for ourselves. Thank you, and we'll see you back in about 15 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that's been a fruitful conversation for you. Back here with Grace, with me in the studio here, and Grace is actively looking through all the questions that are coming through in the chat. And so we'll please, now's a good time to send through some more questions, what might have stimulated your thoughts, your thinking, and then in a few minutes, Grace will be able to pose a couple of those questions for Etha, of course, to see if she can shed some light on the conversation. But before we do so, we wanted to now bring into the conversation another voice, and that is of Jo Green. Jo Green is a lay pastoral leader in Wellington South in New Zealand. And Jo, we welcome you to our conversation today and are really keen to hear how you're living all this on the ground. So welcome, Jo. How are you?
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I just wanted to perhaps explain how I arrived at being a lay pastoral leader. And it really comes out of what we've already heard from Etha as that call or a vocation, and one over a number of years. And when the local parish priest suggested I apply to become a lay pastoral leader, and I was interviewed by the bishop recognises that call, and I went through a period of formation, a minimum of 4 years. It took me 4 years because I already had part of the tertiary qualification. And then at the end of that, the bishop has another look and endorsed me. And some months later, I was able to apply for a vacancy. And then the bishop comes out to the parish and actually commissions or institutes the lay pastoral leader into the parish. So there's quite a visible commissioning, which is what Pope Francis talks about in Corrida Amazonia, that's the way it should happen. But not only the lay pastoral leader, but also the clergy that the lay pastoral leader is going to be working in. And it's an interesting relationship because I'm employed by the bishop and commissioned by the bishop. And like the two priests, I'm accountable to the bishop. The difference is I have an employment agreement and they have made a sacred promise to him. So I thought, well, I was asked to talk about what the role is. What's that role mean? So I'm in a parish with two priests. We're in a so-called co-responsible team, co-workers, as outlined in Lumen Gentium number 33. And I had the pleasure of working with a Father Dave Lancini about 3 years ago in Townsville. I went over and spent a weekend with him, and we're talking about pastoral leadership. And just to quote him, he said that being a pastoral leader means enabling the people of God to be the people of God and to doing whatever it takes to enable them to be the people of God. So that's not often reducible to a series of tasks. What we do as a team, the three of us, the two priests and I, is try to work to our strengths. So Their focus is obviously firstly on the sacramental life of the parish, though I have a lot to do with designing and leading liturgies as well. At the moment, I'm leading the liturgy group to plan the closure of a church, and the parish priest is on that liturgy group, but I'm taking the lead role. I have a background in policing, 32 years policing, up until 5 years ago. So I sort of end up with the emergency management, directing people what to do sort of role. But the big focus, I think, for all of us is enabling parishioners to exercise their ministry. And as we talked about in the chat group that I've just been in, actually enabling people to recognise that what they do is ministry. We were talking about during lockdown, we had I suppose a 6-week lockdown for COVID-19 last year, and the 2 priests and I systematically phoned around parishioners. We found no parishioner who didn't have someone in touch with them. Someone was doing the shopping for them if they were elderly. We had several elderly people who had actually formed their own bubbles. That for us was a demonstration of ministry within the parish, where parishioners were helping each other. So it's the lay pastoral leader role is to, as I say, it's co-worker, co-responsible, collaborative. They are the words that are used in our terms of reference. Not always smooth, and that's where I really appreciated Etha's video that you sent us and her presentation just now, and that there are probably between the 3 of us responsible for the leadership of the parish of Wellington South, 3 different theologies operating. So that means from time to time we're going to rub up against each other. So I think what I learned watching your video, Etha, and then your presentation just now is that probably out of that gift of leadership, we all need to just be a little bit patient with each other, that accept that from time to time the road's going to be a bit rougher than we thought it would be, just to get on and live with it. So the role is really connecting with parishioners. That's how I see it. So if you're not praying with parishioners, you can't connect with them. So I attend funerals in the parish. I visit the bereaved. I go and pray with the deceased in the house of the home. If I see a need for a sacramental role, I visit someone who's sick. Then I'll text one of the priests to carry out that sacramental function. And they will do the same with me. So we might hear, like we did yesterday, that someone needs visiting. And between the 3 of us, we work out just who's going to do that visiting. Does that explain what you wanted to hear?
That's fantastic, Joe. And thank you so much, not only for joining us today and sharing that, but more importantly, for what you're living out and the witness that you're offering in your role. Thank you. So as we explore a little bit further, then I'm going to bring Etha back into the conversation. And just to really bouncing off what Joe has shared, before we go to, I know the questions are piling up, I've seen them coming in, so we'll just be very brief, Etha, just if you want to comment at all on what you've heard from Joe, and particularly I think as we start to distill these 4 aspects, which I'd call them, of lay pastoral ministry in terms of best practice. So I know here's the shiny document here, and I've seen a few people online today from the council, so welcome especially to you and thank you for joining us. But in chapter 4 here, we talk about discernment and formation, so certification and appointment as being some key areas that are important for the role of lay pastoral ministry. And I think I heard Joe talking a little bit about that. So Etha, did you want to just tease them out briefly for us, knowing that, of course, people can find that in the document and online, but just in case people aren't familiar with that sort of framework. Thanks, Etha.
Thank you, and thanks to Joe. I was smiling and nodding as he was speaking. There was a lot of his story and his pathway that resonated with my own. I too was employed and appointed by the bishop and appointed to a particular parish, so accountable to the bishop. Now, the difference is there wasn't a ritual of commissioning in my instance, and it's something I felt the lack of, to be honest. So I think in best practice, there is a huge element of importance to this ritual commissioning. So I think that would be part of it, for sure. In terms of what Joe described, it was quite an extensive formation period which he had to undergo. He said he managed to bypass some of it because he already had prior learning. It's interesting, in my own case, you're right, Richard, I actually had finished my doctorate in theology before beginning lay pastoral work. And much to the surprise of my colleagues in the parish team, I felt the need for more education. They thought I was mad, but a year out of my doctorate, I went back to do a master's in chaplaincy studies and pastoral work. It wasn't required for me, but I felt the need of it in terms of some actual intentional formation in ministry. And given my role at the moment as Director of Pastoral Theology, I have a bias for formation and adequate formation. And I think the more responsibilities that are expected of and given to those in lay leadership positions in close collaboration with their ordained and religious colleagues, I think the more formation and education we should be willing to provide and enable a layperson to engage with. And there could be difficulties there in terms of financing such formation, and that's something to be surmounted. A big thing for me is discernment. In my reflections as part of my master's in chaplaincy studies and pastoral work, I asked myself the hard question, okay, so you were interviewed and appointed and you have a contract, but to what degree was any of that an actual vocational discernment? I asked myself the question, did I really feel called to this, or was it just because I had 9 years of theological study behind me, and as a layperson, I really needed to put food on the table and to join the world as opposed to full-time study? So there's real questions to be asked there in terms of, you know, the level of formation and discernment that we give to those that are preparing for ordained ministry is warranted, and I believe it is so. But I think we need to be maybe thinking a little bit more seriously about the discernment that's needed for lay pastoral ministry. Not just personal discernment and that I feel called to, but also the communal discernment. Most lay people have families and maybe spouses or children, and it's the same for permanent deacons who are married. That's a very important part to their discernment processes with their families. But also the ecclesial formation and discernment. I mean, it can be very difficult, I think. I don't know if you mentioned today, Richard, but you had said to me in our conversations, and I know it was my own experience, that you can, if these are new roles and people haven't met a lay pastoral worker before or a lay pastoral minister, they don't know what it is. You spend a lot of your time explaining yourself, even if you are yourself trying to figure it out, because I was the first person in such a role in my diocese, or in that diocese. It wasn't my home diocese. And so there needs to be a discernment and a formation within the community as well. I think that needs to be part of our best practice. And the last thing I think I would say was I've become even more conscious of this since coming back to Ireland and coming into this role as Director of Pastoral Ministry, of the importance of the need for accreditation and the keeping of standards and quality of practice. And I think accreditation and having an accreditation body is key to providing that. In my own instance, in our work, we've expanded our programs in Maynooth. We would have been known for our parish-based and diocesan-based ministry formations, but more recently, since I became director, we've expanded, if you like, into the healthcare chaplaincy. And that's the one form of ministry in Ireland where there is an accreditation, two accreditation bodies, that, you know, people that have undergone their formation and education have to apply to receive certification. And so as a university, we had to apply for our programs to be recognized, and as other institutions would likewise have to do. So it enables us to maintain our standards. It enables the ministers to maintain their standards. And, it provides a certain confidence and surety of those within communities. This person has gone through a certain amount of training and preparation. We can trust this person to do the role and the task that we are giving them responsibility for.
Terrific. Thank you. And I think it's what we're hearing there, and I can see in the chat myself that people might be sort of standing back a bit and thinking, wow, this is taking it all to a whole new level. But we're talking about different types of people in ministry, aren't we? We've got some people who, like Joe, called to leadership. And that was, I'm not too sure about your own role, but I had a role in parish that had a strong leadership dimension to that as well, alongside the parish priest. So those sorts of roles obviously require a lot more formation. They're going to require a lot more discernment, etc. But then there's terrific people that are involved in really amazing roles, such as our catechists, who and in Australia, they have their own program of discernment that they're called up. They have an ongoing accreditation that's part of their role as well. But it looks a lot different than, say, what Joe was describing, where they might go off for 5 years before you can enter a classroom. But just as importantly, and I saw Cecilia's comment on the chat, she's our director of CCD in this diocese, she talks about mentoring as part of that. And I think that opens up a whole suite of issues in terms of people who are volunteering or employed, and what happens when you walk into that workplace for the first time. Now, that might be you've just got your first children's liturgy. It might be when you're standing in front of the parents for sacramental preparation. So we've done all that training and support, but then how do we ensure a healthy and safe environment for our workers? How do we deal with conflict? How do we deal with the very things that are going to be the meat and drink of any person involved in any role, really, including ministry? And we know that that has taken on an extra significance, particularly in Australia at the moment, as we look at the outcomes from the Royal Commission and safeguarding not only of children, but of vulnerable adults. And sometimes that vulnerable adult's a priest, sometimes it's a lay pastoral minister, or a deacon or someone else, because they've been put into an environment where they're just not sure how to operate anymore, because the person beside them is now taking on a leadership role, or they have been thrust into this role without perhaps that around them. And I think we've touched on that. But what I'm going to do now is just turn to you, Grace, and I think you've got a couple of questions for us. So what do you like to just offer, Etha, some of what's coming through the chat? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Richard. And thank you, Etha and Joe, for your input as well. The feedback and the questions which were coming were terrific. Thank you, everyone, for sending them through. I just grouped them into 3 particular, very, very short topics, and some of them were already covered. So basically what we hear from some people are saying there is a challenge in changing the model whereby the parish priest is one leader in ministry, especially with the task of leading others in discipleship. So other people explored this further and said, what is the interrelationship between discipleship and ministry, between lay and ordained ministry? And then they translated it into what is the co-responsibility. So this is one topic, these relations. Very interestingly, there is a number of people who said, actually, what we have to deal with right now is also clericalization of the laity. And I have had priests say to me, why don't we create a new strata of lay clerics, meaning by appointing lay pastoral ministers as leaders, we are just creating a new lay hierarchy. And some people were acknowledging that this becomes part of a challenge. And the very last one, people were seeking the ways of learning more. They wanted to know where are the point of references for further exploring the idea about differences between the minister and disciple, and seeing a little bit of your references in theology, so they can also learn themselves deeper. They can explore those topics. Hope it's not overwhelming. You can pick something.
I should maybe have been taking those notes. So if I forget to respond to something, you might remind me, Grace. So the first question was, in one sense, I suppose, the juxtaposing of discipleship and ministry, or lay and ordained. And I think that's a real strain running through a lot of, it's in Ireland as well as in Australia. It's in a lot of our communities. This tendency to place different members of our church in competition with one another in terms of our participation in the mission of the church. So that we'll put the minister in competition with the disciple, or the lay person in competition with the ordained person. We don't necessarily use that language, but that I'm suggesting, or what I sense, is what we might actually be at risk of doing. So in the video that I pre-recorded in advance, I tried to draw attention to one American theologian, Richard Gagliardi. Now, I could be butchering his name. I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but he writes and has spoken about this notion that the teaching of the Second Vatican Council provided enough of a foundation to actually move us away from this competitiveness in our approach to ministry and to other aspects of our church, that he talks about a non-competitive approach. How can we realize this? Well, how do we enable better interrelationship between lay and ordained, I think, is a natural question as a result of saying that we shouldn't be in competition with one another. I'm a real advocate for shared formation. So our pastoral programs in Maynooth, we have lay, ordained and religious in the one classrooms, sharing formation with one another, learning from one another's experiences, building up a mutual understanding, a mutual recognition and a mutual trust. Okay, they may not be the people they'll be working with in their future ministry, but they'll have that experience of working and learning alongside other vocations, people from other vocations within and together working towards learning how to do ministry. So I think shared formation, open communication, maybe for outside pastoral supervision and facilitation for a team that might be struggling with their opposing operational theologies. And I think some sustained work at diocesan levels, because something we heard again and again in the research that we undertook in advance of drawing the national guidelines together was the diversity that was present. So I think we need to, and what would happen if a priest transitions into a community where there might be an established and well-working collaboration between different vocations, ordained religious and lay, together in ministry, and a priest transitions in with a completely different vision, and everything maybe vanishes overnight. So there is a need to have joined up thinking, and I think this is where the Australian bishops have been very proactive in trying to provide this resource to allow at a national level for people in the church to come to a shared understanding, at least to provide the pointers of a conversation, so that there can be communal discernment at varying different levels around that. The issue about the clericalization of the laity, I do think that comes to, again, a fear that lay people are trying to replace the ordained, or maybe a misunderstanding of one another, and maybe not fully appreciating and trusting the goodwill at which we each discern our roles and try to fully participate within the life of the church and the mission of the church. There is a risk for any of us to be power hungry. There's a risk for any of us to think that it should be my way or the highway, or the risk for any of us to want to progress and advance. And I guess that's the risk equally for lay people as it is for the ordained or religious. But what I would say is we We just need to be aware of those risks ourselves, and that's part of our communal discernment. Yeah, I think, and I think if we're trying to build a sustainability of lay pastoral ministry and true mutual close collaboration or co-responsibility, then we need to work on that together and realize that we're all at risk of that. I'm talking a lot now. Have I addressed some of those questions? Is there anything I've missed out on?
No, I think totally you have really covered it all. I just would like to, probably mindful of time, to wrap it up with 2 questions, which I will not ask you to answer, but to simply sit with them, because they must be very, very important. In one of the groups, people were asking, how do we call young people into the journey of lay pastoral ministry? And I think this is a big one, probably worth another webinar. And the second one connected with that, what do we actually mean by leadership? What is leadership for us? So that probably will be wrapping up what people were sharing.
Thank you very much, Grace. And thank you, Etha. Look, we're just about on time. So what we're going to do now is just really to say a big thank you to yourself, Etha, for your time today. Just acknowledging the fact that keep your questions coming, or your inspirations, or where things are happening well in your space. It's the shared wisdom of webinars such as this, and we'll try to then put all that information back to you. And if you've got additional questions, whether, and Etha might have some questions for us, so we can try and answer them for her too, because as she says, it's the shared wisdom of the group. So don't feel we're all the experts here. It's as Etha said at the beginning, it's all those voices are important, and what you're doing where you are might be at the cutting edge of this conversation. So we really need to hear from you, both in your questions, but also your lived experience. Just as we finish then today, a great thank you again to you, Etha, and we'll wave goodbye to you. And we're just going to pop up a couple of screens about what's coming up, I suppose, in this area. But before we do so, what I really wanted to do is just touch on again on this resource, Faithful Stewards of God's Grace. And so up on the screen, we're going to look at some of the next steps, and that's included in our next steps. And so one of the things that we're thinking is important is at the back of this document, Faithful Stewards of God's Grace, is this importance of these recommendations, remembering that this document, at least in Australia, was approved by all our bishops and promulgated by them. It was launched at a Proclaim conference, I think by Mark Coleridge at the time. So the first step here we would suggest to you, if you're thinking, where do I go from here? First of all, affirm and celebrate lay pastoral ministry. If you're a priest or an ordained member here, it's a really good opportunity to affirm those in your midst, working alongside you. But with that, we want to be informed. We want to ensure that we're watching videos, the pre-videos from today. And of course, be familiar with these guidelines that are readily available. And we'll give you a couple of hints how to get involved with them. There's the research paper as well from Etha that Etha was involved with, and the Australian climate, which has a lot of the issues were raised in that, and you'll find that in the same website. Over the page, we see there's obviously the opportunity, if you're not connected yet, or if you are, please continue to build networks, not just in lay pastoral ministry, but as Etha was saying, like we do in New South Wales, we have a shared pastoral ministry network of clergy, of ordained and lay people for mutual support. We obviously are wanting to look at some of our best structures in this area of lay pastoral ministry too, and best practices. And as Etha kept certainly reminding us, where's the formation and training opportunities? It's an area we're exploring, looking at the moment, and we're really hopeful to make them more available, more readily available to people, particularly in more of our remote and rural areas and across the Oceana region, where we know that some people might really struggle to access some really good formation. Obviously, that final space is that sharing of resources, so please share, but seek them out too. And if we can go then to our next slide, we see that if you're wanting to look for Faithful Stewards. You can get it for free, a plain copy of it, but to get this beautiful glossy copy that I've got sitting in front of me, that's $11. It's on discount. It's half price at the moment, $11 for the next month or so. And there's some details there, and we'll push that through afterwards in an email to you about how to connect with that. There's obviously some things to keep an eye out for, a survey seeking feedback about this webinar, and we're always wanting to improve what we offer and to get some more advice. We obviously make these slides and this webinar available in the coming week to you and for those that weren't able to experience it today. And a reminder about the next webinar on the 20th of April. So please put that in your diary right now. And you'll see that it's about parishes and schools, one community in Christ. So we're really looking at that relationship between our parishes and schools. Where's that working well? Where can it be improved? And some of the best practices and ideas in that space. So love to have you on board for that. And please share this with others. The other exciting piece of news is that our Live in the Spirit, this is an Oceana conference that's coming up mid-year on the 8th to 10th of July. This is going to have a whole range. I think we've certainly got over 50 workshop presenters already lined up for this, and we will be bringing you more information down the track. But again, if you can mark it in your diary, it's going to be totally online, but as you can see, hopefully through what we're doing here in the studio today and with the help of the Institute for Mission that here in the diocese, we'll certainly try to enhance the quality of that engagement through the Alive in the Spirit conference. Finally, we have an opportunity of an open meeting of the Mission Planners Network of Oceana. That's one of our sponsors. There's people involved in pastoral planning, and so we're really wanting to encourage you, if you can, to come on the 2nd of March. If you're interested in pastoral planning in particular, or if you just want to find out about the goals and work of this network, and to dream and share what's possible in our planning for mission. So again, we'll send you those details. So that's pretty much wraps up our time together. Before we finish, we just want to thank again our sponsors, the Pastoral Ministry Network, the Mission Planners Network of Oceana, and the Diocese of Parramatta. Thank you for the people behind the scenes today that helped bring us to this point. And as we go our separate ways, I think it's an opportunity to think again about our role in pastoral ministry, whether lay or ordained, and how we are called. We are all called to be faithful stewards of God's grace. Thank you, and God bless.